Welcome back to the second segment of Module 1. In this segment, we're going to be talking about, using a database and kind of why we want to use it. And we're going to kind of be using it in terms of the company JCC, the JC Consulting Company that we talked about in the previous segment. And so we're going to kind of use that as an example and kind of demonstrate why we want to use a database as opposed to like a spreadsheet. So let's talk about what a database actually is. And so, we kind of refer to database as being a relational system, a relational model. And that's because the sets of information that we are providing within the database are all related to each other. And that's kind of the key component to a database. And so you can kind of think of it as kind of keeping separate lists of information and then how we tie those lists together. And so we're going to have one list that's going to essentially be like one theme of information. So with JCC, we're going to have separate lists or separate themes of employees, clients, project estimates, and tasks. And so within each list, each entry, if you will, into that list is going to designate a separate, what we refer to as entity. So for example, if we have our client list, right, we're only going to have each client in there one time, right? We're not going to have any redundant information. We're going to separate out the list to specifically just clients, have each client in there one time, and then we're going to have different what we call attributes of that entity. So again, the entity is the client. One example is in the last segment, we looked at kind of one of the spreadsheets from JCC, and one of the clients was Tri-Lakes Realtors, right? So if we're looking at the client list, that Tri-Lakes Realtor is going to be a single entity within that list. And then we're going to have different properties, different kind of pieces of information about that client. So with Tri-Lakes Realtor, we're going to have things like, their contact information, their location, projects that they're working on, things like that. And so those pieces of information about the entity are what we refer to as attributes. And so by looking at the client list, an employee of JCC will be able to see all of the project estimates, their individual tasks, estimated start and stop dates, and things like that. Those are all kind of the attributes. And so we can see all that information just by looking at the clients. And so that's kind of one separate list, right? And so then we're going to have another separate list where the main theme is like project estimates. And so we're going to kind of list those themes by like project ID. And so that project ID is now going to be the entity of this separate list. And then we'll have different attributes associated with those project IDs, those project estimates, including, right, which client it belongs to, the employee that's working on it, the tasks associated with it, things like that. And then we'll have another separate list, again, for the employees of JCC, and their attributes are going to be, which clients they're working with, which project estimates they're working on, so on and so forth. So all of this data is related and connected together, but we're separating it out into kind of separate lists. And then we're creating those relational ties to each other, right? For example, if we have, project estimate, if we have project ID 31, that's going to show us that belongs to the client Tri-Lakes Realtor. It's going to show us the associated tasks with that. And it's also going to show us the estimate for the project as well. And so from there, if we needed to find out more information about that client tied to that project, well, now because we created that relational model between each one of these lists, right, we can now pull that information from the client's list. And so that's kind of what a database is all about. And so kind of that list that I kept talking about, where we're having the separate list of clients and employees and things like that, those are what we call tables within databases. And so we're going to have those separate lists that I talked about, right? Again, they're going to be called tables. That is the official terminology in databases. But we're going to have a table for clients. We're going to have a table for employees. We're going to have a table for project estimates and one for tasks, right? And so when we have that table created, each entry into that table is that entity that I was referring to, right? So for example, the table of clients is going to have an entity of Tri-Lakes Realtor. They're going to have another entity of Project Lead the Way, another entity of Mid-States Auto Auction, so on and so forth. And then the kind of the information about that entity, those are the attributes that I was talking about. And so you may also hear those attributes referred to as field or columns in some cases, right? Column, because if you kind of think about it in a spreadsheet format, those attributes are going to be those columns spanning to the right. Those entities, each entity is going to be the rows, right? Kind of going down the spreadsheet, down the list, right? So again, with the table client, we're going to have those different entities, which are essentially the different clients, right? Tri-Lakes Realtor, and then the next row is going to be Project Lead the Way, and then the next row is going to be Mid-State Auctions. And then the attributes for that client table, for each entity, each row in there, they're going to have those associated attributes, or those kind of fields or columns for those entities. And so in the case of the client table, they're going to have the client name, and then the next column is going to be the street, and then the next column is going to be city, and then state, and then zip, and so on and so forth. And so those are the columns spanning to the right. They're the different attributes or characteristics of each of those specific entities. And so the relationship is how we tie each of these tables together. And so, we have different types of relationships. We have a one-to-one, or a one-to-many, or a many-to-many. For example, our Tri-Lakes Realtor, right? They're going to have a one-to-many relationship with the projects estimate table, right? Because, they're one within the client table, but they're going to have multiple projects and multiple estimates, right? So it's going to be many within the projects estimate table. So that's a one-to-many relationship. And so here's kind of a look at the entities and their associated attributes, right? Rows versus columns again. So the attributes being the columns, in this case of the clients, we have client name, street, city, like I mentioned. And with the projects, we got project start date, client ID, employee ID, and project notes. And so you can see that the relationship between these two, right, is the client ID. So client ID is obviously in the clients table, right? But it's also in the projects ID. And so that's how those two tables get tied together. And so we're going to talk a little bit more in later segments about those relationships and how they're tied together and what those actually mean. Yeah, so just what I was saying, that client ID also exists as an attribute in the projects table, right? So in the future, you're going to hear terminology like keys, like primary keys and foreign keys. And these are kind of how we build those relationships within our database, but more on that later. So that wraps up this second segment for Module 1. I hope this has been beneficial, and we'll see you in the next one.